thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invite to talking at the ARSBC. So since I'm a graduate student, I attended several of the ARSBC meetings, and I always learn a lot from the faculty members that put the program together. And it's for sure a pleasure to be invited to come here and talk to the group and share some of the work that we've been doing and some of the work that other groups have been doing in the area of resynchronization. So over the next 40 minutes, I will try to go over some of the currently available strategies for rebreeding females that fail to become pregnant in the first round of artificial insemination. I'm going to try to go over as well what you expect in this resynchronization programs, and I think that's a really important point when we're talking about resynchronization, and particularly when you're using a fixed time to AI approach. And towards the end, I'm going to try to share some of the research that we're doing in order to try to optimize these resynchronization programs and maybe talk a little bit about some potential future directions for resynchronization. So the program yesterday did a really great job at covering why incorporating Estrus synchronization and fixed time AI, both not only in a seed stock setting, but predominantly in a commercial cow-calf operation setting. And one of the things that the speakers covered, Jordan, Dan, as well as Joe Dalton, was the fact that, you know, when we incorporate these synchronization programs, we can eliminate the need of estrus detection, right? But not only that, when you go there and consider estrus synchronization and fixed time to AI, we can increase the number of cows that get exposed to AI. And through that, you know, we can go there and do a good job and make some rapid, some good sire selection decisions and make some improvements from a genetic selection standpoint more rapidly than we normally would in a natural service setting. On top of that, when we consider these synchronization programs, we can also very often decrease the cost with cleanup bulls. And not only that, you know, we can also alter the calving distribution. And by altering calving distribution, and Jordan did a really good job talking about this yesterday, is that idea that we can get more cows calving in the beginning of the calving season. And by doing so, we ultimately end up increasing calf value because we ultimately increase calf performance. But not only that, as we think about those cows that become pregnant early, that calve early, when they go to their subsequent breeding season, they have more time to recover, and consequently, they end up having a little bit better fertility as well. So, you know, Estrus synchronization is a really, really powerful tool. And for those of you that were not connected to the program yesterday, one of the take-home messages from yesterday is that idea that synchronization and timed AI has benefits that go beyond just the genetic improvement of the herd, right? So, and there's a really nice study that I always try to share with producers here in Georgia, which is a study that was done by Dr. Cliff Lamb's group, where basically they have cows exposed to a controlled treatment, which was basically cows were exposed only to natural service mating. And then they went there and they had, within the same herds, cows exposed to a timed AI treatment, right? So those cows are exposed to an industry standard Estrus synchronization protocol followed by timed AI. And then after timed AI, they use, those cows were kept with cleanup bulls throughout the remaining of the breeding season. And what's really interesting about this study is that, you know, the authors of this study made an effort to select the sires that were utilizing this AI program to have similar EPDs to the sires that were being utilized in a natural service setting. And their idea here was to isolate the effect of the synchronization itself and take away some of that benefits that we experience when we utilize synchronization and timed AI due to the genetic improvement, right? And one of the things that, you know, that was really remarkable about the study is the fact that, you know, when you look at the percentage of cows calving here, based on the treatments that those cows were exposed, so the red bars here represent cows exposed to timed AI, and the gray bars represent cows exposed to a controlled treatment, you can see that we can significantly increase the proportion of cows calving early in the first 21 days in the calving season. And as Dr. Dalton mentioned yesterday, you know, when we get those cows to calve early, ultimately those calves are going to be older at the time of weaning, right? But not only that, they're going to be heavier at weaning. So as we think about incorporating these reproductive management strategies, this is something that I always try to emphasize, is that a lot of the benefits, you know, they go beyond just that idea of genetic improvement. And there's a lot of whole system changes from a cow-calf setting and from a cow-calf standpoint that, you know, end up adding value to these cow-calf operations that end up incorporating these strategies. And one study that really compile all of that, and it's what we call a case study that demonstrates the power of these reproductive technologies, is a study that was done at the North Florida Research and Educational Center by Dr. Cliff Lamb as well, where they had a herd that was exposed to 120 days breeding season. And over the course of 5 years, they gradually decrease the length of the breeding season. And they did that by using artificial insemination, synchronization and artificial insemination to shift the calving distribution. And so here we have the timeline of their breeding season in 2007 and 2012, okay? So by 2012, they're able to have the breeding season restricted to about 70 days. And what they noticed in this study that was really interesting as well, with that idea of changing the calving distribution. So here we have, again, the percentage of cows that calved based on the different days of the calving season, okay? And each one of these lines here that I'm showing you now represent a different calf crop, right? So going all the way from 2007 to 2013, as we decrease the length of the breeding season and incorporate synchronization programs. And what's really nice about that study is that, you know, as you move through those years and as you gradually decrease the length of the breeding season and incorporate synchronization, you end up shifting that calving distribution. So if we come here and compare the year of 2013, this blue line here, with 2007, you can see that there's a substantial shift on when those cows are calving. And here we can have the vast majority of our cows calving within the first 50 days of the breeding season. And what that does to the cow herd is pretty remarkable, right? One of the things that producers are usually concerned is the idea that, you know, as we move forward and we decrease the length of the breeding season, we might be seeing a decrease in fertility, right? Because we have cows are exposed to sires for a shorter period of time. But the reality is, you know, if we're making some good culling decisions based on pregnancy status and the end of the breeding season, what we see when we incorporate these reproductive management strategies is that we end up seeing an increase in fertility. And the reason for that is because, you know, we end up allowing our cows to recover better before the beginning of the subsequent breeding season, which over time leads to an increase in overall herd fertility. But what's neat about this data set here is that, you know, Dr. Lamb and Vitor was also involved in this study. What they did is, again, they try to, you know, put genetics aside to some extent, and they did some mathematical models here to estimate the difference in calf value based on solely the difference in calving distribution and the calving date records that they had. So basically they assume a constant rate of growth of the calves, and they look at the difference in calf age based on when those cows were calving. And what they notice is, you know, as you shift that calving distribution, going from 2007 to 2013, and you increase the age of these calves, okay, what you do is you end up weaning heavier calves, and when you plug a dollar value to that, you end up adding substantial amounts of dollars to your overall cow-calf calf crop return. And here, you know, these are values from 2015. And, you know, before coming here, I did a simulation with today's value. So as you remember, 2015 calf prices were substantially higher than they are today. So this value might be a little bit overestimating. But, you know, if we use today's cattle prices, we'll be seeing a profit in this specific data set of about $13,000. So that's pretty substantial. But, you know, as we think about those herds that are already incorporating these estrus synchronization strategies together with fixed time AI, the majority of those herds are exposing cows to a synchronization program, right? So this is an example of the 7 days co-sync procedure program, likely one of the most utilized in the industry still today. And basically, after usually about 10 to 14 days after the first round of fixed timed AI, we're going to turn on our cleaning pools for the remaining of the breeding season. And when you look at some meta-analysis evaluating across the board the performance of these synchronization programs, usually what we see as an industry average of pregnancy rates are pregnancy rates that range between 40 and 60%, right? There's some variations from herd to herd, and there's a variety of factors that are going to influence whether you're going to be closer to a 40% range or closer to a 60% range of pregnancy rates. But the reality is that, utilizing a single round of artificial insemination in a fixed time setting, we're getting about half, we're generating ultimately about half of our calf crop through artificial insemination. So as we think about the potential to add value to our calf crop from a genetic improvement standpoint, and now we have some excellent programs that add value to calf crops that have genetically superior animals. How can we manage our herds from a reproductive management standpoint to maximize the number of AI pregnancies that we're going to be generating? And, as we think about the factors that influence fertility in a fixed time AI program, we know that there's a variety of factors that do that, right? I have only some of them laid out here. And, if you go to the Beef Reproduction Task Force and go through the previous proceedings of the ARSBC meetings, there's some really excellent resources guiding producers on how to manage these different aspects. But assuming that we're talking about operations that are doing a good job at managing those factors and they're achieving pregnancy rates that are acceptable for the expectations of that operation, and they're thinking about a potential next step to maximize the number of AI pregnancies. So I wanted to go over some of the alternatives that are available as we think about rebreeding strategies to increase the number of genetically superior pregnancies that we're generating. And I'm talking about genetically superior pregnancies, and throughout our presentation here, I'm going to be focusing on AI. But keep in mind that a lot of these concepts are also applied as we think about embryo recipient management, right? So tweaking these programs a little bit can go a long ways in an embryo transfer program as well, as we think about maximizing the number of genetically superior pregnancies in an embryo transfer recipient management point of view. So one alternative that we have to maximize the number of AI pregnancies is to utilize estrus detection after the first round of AI. So for example, we can get a group of cows or heifers, expose them to an industry standard estrus synchronization protocol, like we have the 7 days co-sync procedure program here, followed by 1 round of timed AI. And then after the timed AI, we go there and perform estrus detection. And, based on an AM/PM rule, we artificially inseminate animals that exhibit estrus. So we know that the majority of the non-pregnant females are going to exhibit estrus between 15 and 25 days after the first round of AI. If you want to be more conservative, we know that sometimes, we have some outliers that might show estrus a little bit earlier than that. So if you're thinking about utilizing an approach like that, these are things to keep in mind. One thing that we strongly recommend as we think about estrus detection is the use of estrus detection aids, right? And there's a variety of those in the market. Here I have just an example of one of them, the breeding indicators here from Estrotect, where basically you can use these resources to, increase the accuracy of your estrus detection systems. But keeping in mind, there are several challenges associated with heat detection. And, this is a resource that is also available on the Beef Reproduction Task Force. And we had a conversation about that yesterday, idea of conception rate versus pregnancy rate. So for the purpose of this table here, we're defining conception rate as the number of cows pregnant based on the number of cows exposed or number of cows serviced, right? As you're thinking about an artificial insemination setting. And here, pregnancy rates, I'm referring to the number of cow pregnant based on the total number of females in the herd, right? And this is important in the context of estrus detection. And as we think about potentially rebreeding cows in an estrus detection setting, if we come here and we keep conception rates constant, meaning that for every cow that we AI, we have a constant pregnancy rate, right? A constant conception rate. So in this case, we're talking about 70%. What I want to draw your attention here is that, as we decrease our estrus detection rate, we're going to ultimately decrease the number of pregnancies that we're generating. Okay, so this is important for those of you that are potentially considering, rebreeding animals in a heat detection setting. Keep in mind that, estrus detection is really important. And as you consider that strategy, keep in mind that it's a labor requiring strategy, but it's not only labor requiring, it also requires a good quality labor, right? So you need trained personnel that can go there and accurately detect animals that are in estrus, and that ultimately is going to drive your estrus detection rate. So one of the ways that we can overcome that is through the utilization of resynchronization programs that eliminate the need for estrus detection if we use a fixed time AI approach for a second artificial insemination. And this is an example of an alternative that you can use for resynchronizing cows, and that's what we're calling here as a known pregnancy status approach. And the way that works, you go there, and you expose your heifers or cows, your females, to an industry standard estrus synchronization protocol. Here I'm using the 7 days co-sync procedure as an example, followed by a round of fixed time AI, right? So then we come here, and then with a conventional ultrasound equipment, we can perform pregnancy diagnosis, usually starting around day 28. We can potentially push that a little bit later than that. And, we go there, differentiate the pregnant and non-pregnant cows. And then the non-pregnant cows go there and get exposed to a second round of estrus synchronization followed by fixed time artificial insemination. In this example here, we are again using 7 days co-sync placebo program. And one of the things to keep in mind, as I was talking about earlier, and as we think about our presentations from yesterday, is that the timing of pregnancy is really important, right? So for producers considering resynchronization and utilizing a fixed time AI approach, one thing to keep in mind is that these pregnancies here for the second artificial insemination are being generated about almost 40 days after that first AI, right? So in order to justify getting those cows pregnant a little bit later, we need to really have an added value. So potentially in a seed stock operation to justify utilizing such a resynchronization strategy. One way we can partially decrease that interval between these two fixed time artificial inseminations is the use of estrus synchronization and resynchronization with what we call an unknown pregnancy status. And by that, I mean, we expose cows to one round of synchronization and timed AI, and we start resynchronizing the whole herd before we actually go there and perform a pregnancy diagnosis. So basically here we come in at day 21, assuming we're ultrasounding cows on day 28, and we put a seeder in, give a GnRH injection. That seeder stays in for 7 days. So here, 28 days after the first round of AI, we go there and perform their ultrasound evaluation, right? So in this case here, if we were to give a prostaglandin injection to the whole herd, we will be causing abortion in the cows that are pregnant, right? So basically what we do here, we remove the seeder from all the cows enrolled in the program. However, we only give a prostaglandin injection to the ones that are non-pregnant after our ultrasound evaluation. And those cows are then fixed time artificially inseminated about 60 hours later, if we're talking about cows, 54 hours later, if we're talking about heifers here. But what I want to draw your attention here is that by using this approach, we can decrease the interval between the first and the second AI from about 40 days to about 30 days here, okay? So one of the common things that we get asked is what you expect in a resynchronization setting, particularly when we're talking about resynchronizing animals with unknown pregnancy status. And, Dr. George Perry's group, back when they were in South Dakota, now they're at Texas A&M, but they did a really nice study where they were evaluating 2 different resynchronization strategies and evaluating the need of a seeder in a resynchronization program, like the resynchronization program with unknown status that I mentioned earlier. And I'm not going to show specifically the treatment's results here, but I just want to give you something to think about as we look at, a large data set like this. They had about 16 different groups of animals enrolled in this study, about 1,500 head. These are both groups of cows and heifers. And, here I have in this table here the different groups and the results for the number of animals per group, as well as the pregnancy ratio AI for the first AI, the second AI, and their final pregnancy rates here. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that these pregnancy rates account for the losses that occurred in the first artificial insemination here. And what I want to draw your attention here is that the pregnancy rates to the second round of fixed-time artificial insemination, and this is something that we observe here in the groups that we're working with in a resynchronization setting, they're usually about 10% less than the pregnancy rates for the first AI. And this is what we see here when we compile the data from this study from all herds across all treatments, and including both heifers and cows here, okay? But one of the things that I want to draw your attention is, you know, there are variations in fertility between herds, right? Herds are producers are managing their cattle different, they're making decisions different, and those decisions ultimately matter, right? And they matter not only in a fixed time AI approach, in a single fixed time AI approach, but also in a resynchronization setting. So we can come through this table here and find some herds that has some pretty significant results with regards to resynchronization in fertility. So for example, if we come to herd 1 here, you know, these guys were generating about 75, and that's not a small herd, about 150 head. They're generating about 76% of their pregnancies through artificial insemination by incorporating a synchronization program followed by resynchronization. And this is while eliminating estrus detection as well. So, you know, there is the opportunity of really increasing the number of pregnancies generated. But, you know, it's important that we keep realistic expectations for that. So, you know, as I was setting up my slides for today's presentation, I went to the Beef Reproduction Task Force, and I played a little bit with the Estrus Synchronization Planner. And one of the really nice outputs of the Estrus Synchronization Planner is the cost per pregnancy in conception rate relationship that it provides us. So basically, if you go there to the Beef Reproduction Task Force and you download your Estrus Synchronization Planner and you make your input of your herd information, here, assume we're dealing with a herd of predominantly Bostar's cows, about 100 head herd, that is being bred with a conventional semen in a 7 days co-syn placenta program. And this is the relationship between the cost of pregnancy here and the conception rates, okay? So as you can see, the cost of pregnancy decrease as pregnancy rates increase, right? And the idea is pretty straightforward right here. But what I want you to think about as we think about resynchronizing animals and the fact that the literature, as well as the data that we see in the field, indicates that resynchronization results in a timed AI setting, they're usually about 10% less than your first round of AI, right? So as you think about the cost in your budgeting resynchronization programs in your operation, this is something that it's important to account for, right? So some of the things that we got to think about is that not only we're generating, our conception rates are going to be less, and consequently our cost per pregnancy is going to be greater as we compare to our first round of AI. But, you know, as we start thinking about all that and from a profit standpoint, some of the things that we got to think about is what is, you know, in our system, what is the actual value added for an additional AI pregnancy, right? So as I'm thinking about maximizing those numbers, and Jordan Thomas did a really good job yesterday mentioning that, you know, sometimes there are in some situations that, you know, maximizing your AI pregnancy rates might not be the best fit for your operation. And I agree with that. And this is important in a resynchronization setting as well. You know, as we're thinking about, okay, am I going to strictly breed my cows with a single round of timed AI, or am I going to incorporate a resynchronization system? This is important. So am I able to further decrease the need for cleanup bulls? Or, you know, what's my plan for resynchronization? Am I going to use estrus detection and AI? Am I going to do a resynchronization in a timed AI approach? These are always really important to consider in mainly because of that idea, right? Maximizing pregnancy rates through AI, it has to be done in a way that it's cost efficient, right? So one of the things that I get asked a lot as well, every time we talk about resynchronization, is that idea that, you know, can these resynchronization programs induce pregnancy loss? And this is based on some really good literature that indicates, you know, that nutritional management after insemination, as well as, you know, transportation stress and handling stress after AI can decrease fertility. to the first artificial insemination. So, you know, it's amazing that we don't have a whole lot of control studies in a resynchronization setting, comparing animals that were exposed to a single timed AI like this one that I'm bringing up here, and animals that were exposed to a resynchronization either through a known pregnancy status approach or an unknown pregnancy status approach. So I got this data out of South America in Brazil, where, you know, Brazil is really pushing their industry forward from a resynchronization standpoint. And this is data where they had 2 treatment groups in this study. Half of the animals were exposed to timed AI followed by natural service, whereas the other half were exposed to timed AI follow a resynchronization program with unknown pregnancy status. And here they have their final pregnancy rates to the first round of AI. And you can see that there are no differences here. And then when you look at the pregnancy loss, and in this case, we're talking about animals that lost their pregnancy between day 30 and 60 after the first round of AI. And basically what that study showed, with about 600 head, is that in their production system, they're not seeing that increase in embryonic mortality when we expose those animals to a resynchronization program. So one of the things that I want to draw your attention as we move towards more the end of the presentation is that, you know, as we're thinking about timing of pregnancy in resynchronization program, you notice that both for the known pregnancy status resynchronization approach and the unknown pregnancy status resynchronization approach that I showed you here today, both of them are limiting ability to decrease that timing between the 2 fixed time artificial inseminations is when we can go in with a conventional ultrasound and perform pregnancy diagnosis. So that I want to share with you some of the research that we're doing with a new ultrasound technology that relies on color Doppler evaluation of the Corpus Luteum to figure out which cows are experiencing Luteolysis and consequently recognize open cows to resynchronize a little bit earlier than we normally do with a conventional ultrasound system. And I have a picture here from Brazil, is because a lot of the research that has been done in that area has been done by reproductive physiologists in Brazil. So we're trying to translate some of that to our production system here. So our rationale as we think about utilizing the color Doppler as a tool for pregnancy diagnosis is the fact that, you know, as we think about a conventional pregnancy diagnosis, usually we're trying to identify fluid or the presence of an embryo inside that uterine lumen there. And that limits us to the development of that conceptus, right? Which usually, you know, we start getting a good fluid accumulation around day 25 of gestation. Usually we're good and accurate at detecting pregnancy around day 28. We can arguably get some people that are really good and go a little bit earlier than that. But, you know, cows are undergoing luteolysis before they actually start accumulating that large amount of fluid in the uterus that we can recognize with a conventional ultrasound. And this is a diagram just showing that, right? The changes in CL area in pregnant cows, this is the solid line here, and non-pregnant cows, the dashed line here. So you can see that the CL, which is the structure in the ovary of the cow that produces progesterone and is required for pregnancy, starts regressing significantly here around day 20 of gestation, right? And what's interesting is that some of that research in Brazil showed that before that structural luteolysis occur, or that CL actually regresses in size, we see a decrease in the blood flow to that corpus luteum. And that's what the color Doppler technology does, right? So we can go there and try to estimate the amount of blood flow that we're visualizing in that corpus luteum. So, you know, when we look at a conventional ultrasound, this is what we're looking for. This is a day 29 pregnancy. You know, we're looking for a cross section of the uterus here with a black pocket full of fluid with a button-like structure, which is the day 29 embryo here. So when you bring your veterinarian in around day 29 and 30 days after breeding, that's what you're going to be looking at. But, you know, as we think about that color Doppler technology, we're going to go in a little bit earlier, around day 20, and we're still in the research process of this technology. And we grab that ovarian structure and we try to find that luteal structure, and that's what I have here. So here on the right, we have a luteal structure with a conventional ultrasound, and on the left, we have that same corpus luteum in a color Doppler. And all those orange and blue dots are signs of blood movement in the corpus luteum. So in this figure, we're seeing a lot of blood flow in that luteal structure, which indicates to us that the luteal structure is active. But it's interesting that we see a lot of variations from cow to cow, particularly when they're undergoing luteolysis. So here on the left, I have a cow with high blood perfusion with an active functional corpus luteum, which would indicate that the cow is potentially pregnant. And here on the right, we have a cow with really low blood perfusion. So even though she has a corpus luteum there with a conventional ultrasound, it seems like that corpus luteum is undergoing luteal regression, which would indicate that she's open, okay? And these were all collected at day 20 of gestation. So we went back to some of that research in Brazil that tried to evaluate how accurately we can detect that pregnancy. And there's some variation, whether we're talking about dairy herds or beef herds. In some of the research with beef herds, they have some pretty good results with only 9% false positive rates and 0% false negative rates, okay? Meaning that basically when they go in and perform these evaluations, they're not calling a pregnant cow open, okay? But there's some pregnant cows that they end up calling those cows as, there are some open cows there are some cows that they're calling pregnant, but as they compare to a day 30 ultrasound, those cows turn out to be open in a day 30 ultrasound. And just a small proportion of those, okay? So, we know that there are some subspecies differences between Bosindicus and Bostaros with regards to the characteristics of their luteal structure. So our group has been trying to see if we can translate those findings that they had in Brazil into our production system here in Brazil and here in the US. So we did a study with about 400 animals now where we evaluated the use of color Doppler on day 20 and day 22 of gestation. And here I have a layout of that experimental design. And basically what we did is we compare the color Doppler day 20 and day 22 with a conventional ultrasound at day 30 serving as a gold standard, right? To evaluate how accurate we can be with the color Doppler ultrasound. So we established a series of thresholds that for the sake of time, I'm not gonna go over today to differentiate how much blood flow is required to consider a cow pregnant in a Doppler evaluation. But what I do want to do is share with you some of our results, okay? And here I have our results with postpartum cows and here with replacement heifers. And you can see that we have some pretty similar results on day 20 and 22 to the results that they're observing in Brazil, where we see 0 false negative rates. So, and this is important, right? As we think about resynchronizing these animals, if you were to give a prostaglandin injection to one of these cows, to these cows that are being considered open with a color Doppler evaluation, we wouldn't be causing abortions because the cows that we're calling open, they're actually open. But there are some cows that, they're gonna represent a missed opportunity as we think about resynchronizing them because we're calling them pregnant, but the reality is, at day 30, they turn out to be open, okay? So there's about a 10% false positive rate on average when we look across the board here with cows and heifers. There's a variety of factors that could be driving those differences and those small numbers of false positive results, potentially lack of estrus synchrony, embryonic mortality. But one thing to keep in mind is that every time we're talking about pregnancy diagnosis, we're talking about taking a snapshot of what's happened, right? And there's some really nice compiled data out of Dr. Poller's group that evaluate different stages that characterize the different pregnancy loss periods in beef herds. And they usually divide those as early embryonic mortality, as the embryonic mortality happened in the first 30 days. And what I want to draw your attention here is that when we go at day 30, a lot of those pregnancy losses have already occurred, right? But when you go at day 20, there's a lot of cows that we might be considering pregnant here at day 20. But the reality is when we compare to when we go back and run those cows through again 30 days after breeding, some of these cows are coming out open. So we still don't know exactly whether the color Doppler is, where some of these cows are actually pregnant when we're evaluating them, but they turn out to be open later because of pregnancy loss. And we're currently working on that, on trying to understand some of these mechanisms. So, is there a potential use for color Doppler in the near future? So this is just a summary of the data, and this is our heifer data. So our pregnancy rates in that study was 60%, okay? So basically that means that we have about 40% of our replacement heifers open. And out of those 40%, we failed to detect 4% of those. So meaning that we call them pregnant at day 20 of gestation, but they're actually open, right? So in a resynchronization setting, we will be able to expose 36% of the 40% open replacement heifers for resynchronization strategy. And I still don't have the final pregnancy diagnosis for the heifers, but I just want to give you some food for thought here as we think about potentially considering the use of color Doppler in the future. What I did here was, I got their conventional ultrasound and held that conventional ultrasound on day 29 to the same standards we're holding the color Doppler evaluation on day 20, right? So I used the conventional ultrasound here on day 29 and compare that to a conventional ultrasound at the end of the breeding season. And we see something really similar, right? So basically, because some cows are naturally experiencing what we call late embryonic mortality, there's some of those cows that are pregnant on day 29. We go there, we see a embryo there, but they're actually open at the end of the breeding season because they lose their AI pregnancy, right? So as we think about that, the conventional ultrasound at day 29 is also failing to detect some of those cows that are going to lose their pregnancy later on. So, as we think about trying to potentially detect pregnancy early, that's something to keep in mind. The earlier we go, the earlier we try to detect pregnancy, the more likely we are going to be running into some of those embryonic mortality factors that might be, to some extent, decreasing the accuracy of these techniques. But ultimately, what I think personally that it's going to drive whether we can utilize Doppler at day 20 or not in an applied setting to resynchronize animals is how the fertility is going to turn out in these resynchronization programs when we combine resynchronization with color Doppler ultrasound. So with that, just to wrap up our conversation here today, synchronization and AI are in fact a powerful tool to improve reproductive management and optimize genetics in our herd. And we can, give that next step if you want to try to potentially, if there's a benefit in our operation to maximize the number of AI pregnancies that are generating through, potentially incorporating some estrus detection in AI, or potentially incorporating resynchronization in combination with fixed time AI. But, the main thing that I want you to take home here is that, as you consider those rebreeding strategies, make sure you have some realistic expectations, particularly with the fact that, your conception rates are going to be likely a little bit less than your first round of artificial insemination. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody involved in some of the data collection for the studies that I shared here today, and particularly the Angus Foundation that has funded the project with the color Doppler. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Sandy,